Good evening, everyone. Excuse me. My name is Benedict Klecka, Executive Director of the Redwood Library. My voice is compromised at the moment. Uh, I don't have an exact explanation, but never mind. Um, we're thrilled to have Professor Dorinda Evans speak to us this evening. Um, she's one of the eminent figures in the field of American art, and she's going to talk about a portrait that we've had in the Redwood collections for many years. The copy of the Gilbert Stuart Lansdowne portrait. Now, she is an eminent scholar and has been around for many years, um, notably as a curator and a professor. She was at one point at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, and she taught for many years at Emory University. She's the author of many important books. Uh, I don't want to go on, but you can look her up. She's a very serious person, and we're excited to have her speak to us tonight. So, welcome everyone, and thank you, Professor Evans. And there will be a Q&A after, so stay tuned and get all your questions ready. So, thank you very much, and I'll see you shortly.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm very fond of the library here, the Redwood Library, because when I began working on Stuart, I visited it frequently and particularly remember Donald Gibbs, who was the librarian there back in the 1970s and 80s, I guess. He was there for several years. And he was, I had a lot of interaction with him and we corresponded back and forth with regard to Stuart. So I have good memories. Okay, let's pop this out. Let me get this. Yeah. Okay. I think I'd recommend that all of you pop these images out so you can see them more closely, because a lot of this depends upon being able to have good pictures. So beginning right away with this talk on the pictures that were frauds, getting away with fraud, the Lansdowne portraits of George Washington. Our discussion enters on begins with a 1796 life-size, full-length portrait of George Washington by the famous early American artist Gilbert Stuart, called the Lansdowne portrait. Next. More particularly, we are concerned with the English artist William Winstanley, who copied a replica of this picture several times and passed off at least one copy as a genuine work by Stuart. His fake was so successful that the White House purchased it. This is uniquely relevant in that one of Winstanley's 7 known copies, all about 8 by 5 feet, is owned by the Redwood Library. For some time, it was thought to be by Stuart's artist daughter, Jane. Essentially, this is a talk about a series of unsigned, unattributed pictures after Stuart's Lansdowne portrait and their attribution now to Winstanley. Next. Next. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I think there's one that was before this. Could we just go back? The very next one from that. Yes, this one. Okay. Very little has been known. No, you can go to the next one after this, the third one. No, forward. No. Very little has been known about Winstanley, other than the rumor that he forged the full length of George Washington, seen here in the White House. That's on the left. Described as a young man of good family, quote unquote, Winstanley arrived in New York from London in about 1791. He had a church connection, and having been welcomed by prominent New York citizens, carried their letters of introduction to others. One such letter was from Chief Justice of the United States to Alexander Hamilton, then Secretary of the Treasury in Philadelphia. Hamilton, in turn, supplied recommendations for Winstanley in 1793 as a landscape painter, citing the fact that George Washington had already purchased 2 of his Hudson River scenes. Winstanley told Hamilton that he had turned to painting because he had lost a small fortune in England through naive generosity. Given his worldly nature, that he should be naive seems unlikely. He also claimed to be self-taught as an artist, which probably is true. Next. The United States government purchased the White House full length of Washington in 1800, but as a replica by Stuart himself of his first full-length portrait of Washington. Wait a minute. On the right. Let's go back. That shouldn't be the details. It should be the full length, yeah. So the one on the right is the original, and the one on the left is Winstanley's copy that the White House bought. Years later, the forgery claim, citing Winstanley as the culprit, first appeared publicly in a New York newspaper in 1817. It might have been forgotten then if it had not been reintroduced to the public and widely publicized by the inclusion in an 1834 history of American art, written by the historian William Dunlap. As for the English-trained Gilbert Stuart, whose work Winstanley copied, he returned to the United States from Ireland in 1794 in order to record the likeness of the much-admired Washington, especially in terms of capturing the former general's noble character, where others had failed. After a series of sittings, Washington was generally acknowledged to have produced the finest portraits of Washington taken from life. Stuart's full-length, life-size portrait of Washington, showing the president addressing both houses of Congress, and called the Lansdowne portrait after its first owner, the Marquis of Lansdowne, was sufficiently well received to stimulate a demand for copies. Stuart painted 3 replicas, including versions at the Brooklyn Museum and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. A New York City museum owner, Gardner Baker, who had encouraged Winstanley and featured Winstanley's pictures in his museum, purchased the 3rd replica as part of his museum collection and a potential touring attraction. It is this 3rd portrait by Stuart, the missing so-called Baker portrait, that is at the heart of this discussion and has long been a focus of controversy. The committee for furnishing the president's house in Washington purchased the portrait from Baker's creditor, Thomas Lang, after Baker's death. However, the story given in Dunlap's 1834 history becomes complicated at this point. Lang, living in upstate New York, was removed from Baker's museum. So after acquiring the picture, he evidently lent it to the New York City-based Winstanley for storing. The transfer to Winstanley had to have been sometime after November 24, 1798, the last date the Baker portrait was on exhibition in Boston before its return to Baker's widow in New York. In passing the picture to Winstanley, Lang must have known that the artist intended to copy it, having lent him landscape prints for this purpose before. About 18 months later, after Lang sold the portrait to the White House committee, he asked Langley, this is the mistake, to pack the picture for shipment to Washington. According to the historian Dunlap, Winstanley then betrayed Lang's trust and fulfilled his packing request by sending one of his copies and keeping the original that had been destined for the president's house. Confirming part of this tale, Stuart, when he saw the supposed Baker portrait in the White House in August of 1802, denied that he had ever painted it. His actual words later were that it was not by him, but he had, quote unquote, bargained for it, meaning he had expected Winstanley, whom he knew, to do something like this. For over 200 years, scholars and White House visitors have argued over whether the White House picture is a Lansdowne replica by Stuart or a copy by Winstanley. With new research, a convincing argument can be offered that the White House portrait is actually by Winstanley, and one of several almost identical copies made from the missing Baker portrait. At the outset, several points might be made. First, the Baker portrait, when it was exhibited in Baker's New York Museum, was generally, quote unquote, allowed to be a masterpiece, one of Stuart's finest portraits, quote, as a piece of art, unquote, in terms of likeness and execution. Dunlap promoted the Baker portrait in his history as the first chronologically of Stuart's 3 replicas. He sought out the picture at Baker's museum, and the friend who accompanied him reported that they found it truly admirable. A journalist supported this view with some enthusiasm, calling it, quote, enlivened and, quote, animated. Baker wrote to a friend, quote, it is universally admitted that my Washington is really by far the best picture in the universe. All men of taste tell me that I must go to Europe with my picture. In this regard, Baker had most likely been able to obtain a replica of such high quality because Stuart had been told or had expected this showman, Baker, would exhibit it for admissions fees abroad. Secondly, the portrait that the White House received was decidedly inferior and could not be the same picture that had inspired such glowing descriptions. On its arrival, the White House version was judged a disappointment and not of the quality to be expected from Stuart. Rival politicians even seized on this as an outrageous extravagance, not worth the $800 that the Federalists had paid for it. In truth, the portrait does not have the translucent flesh color, the painterly finesse, and the ethereal dignity of a superb likeness by Stuart. Next. A comparison of the White House and Lansdowne heads demonstrates this difference. The facial expression in the White House version on the left, which should deal with Washington's character, lacks the sentience and aristocratic content of Stuart's portrayals of the first president. The White House one, for instance, has been described as having empty, staring eyes, almost fish-eyed. It can also be demonstrated, though, through later biographical information, that it would be entirely characteristic of Winstanley to make the switch. Furthermore, and perhaps most importantly, the White House portrait is very close to a group of Lansdowne copies that can now be assigned to Winstanley. While Winstanley is known to have copied the missing Baker portrait, not one of his probable full-length reproductions, especially for the White House version, except for the White House version, has an early enough history of ownership to be traceable to him. This includes the Redwood portrait, which does not have an early provenance. However, Winstanley also transcribed the head from the Baker portrait as a bust length or head and shoulders image. Next. Fortunately, one of these copies belonged to George Suckley, a prosperous New York merchant. And this can be traced to Winstanley, this portrait, which is on the left. And it gives some sense of Winstanley's style when copying Stuart. In July of 1799, Suckley in Baltimore recorded in his letter book that he had just written a reply to Winstanley, who had sought his advice, and he expected to see Winstanley soon in New York. According to the letter, Suckley, who lent money professionally, did not want Winstanley to draw on his line of credit with him for what he needed, but he would assist him financially when he returned to New York. Suckley also advised him, quote, unquote, not to go into business. The proposed undertaking seems to have involved picture copying, with the possibility of Suckley acting as financial backer. More than 6 months later, Suckley wrote to him again in late February of 1800 from Baltimore And this time the record suggests involvement in a business deal concerning Winstanley's paintings that ended soon afterward. Sukely had received Winstanley's pictures and would deliver them on receiving $100, which Winstanley owed him. There is no indication in Sukely's extensive series of account books that Winstanley reimbursed him, or relatedly, that Sukely ever paid anyone for the bust-length portrait of Washington that he ended up owning. It happens to be of the Lansdowne type that Winstanley was producing. Very likely, Sukely kept it to erase Winstanley's debt, or it served as collateral for a loan never reimbursed. Next slide. Despite the fact that the White House portrait was overcleaned in the 19th century and retouched several times by conservators under the impression that it was by Stuart, the head is closer to that of the Sukely portrait than it is to the head in Stuart's Lansdowne original or in Stuart's replicas. You can see that here with the Sukely portrait detail on the left and the White House portrait upper right, and then the Lansdowne by Stuart lower right. That difference in the way Stuart paints is the kind of a lighter and even more nervous touch. Indeed, they follow each other almost exactly, that is, as copies, in terms not only of the drawing, but of the slant of the head. That is the Sukely and the White House one at the top, which is different from the more upright position in Stuart's known Lansdowne duplicates. And neither has the characteristic delicacy of Stuart's work. Some viewers, including Stuart's daughter Jane, thought the coloring in the White House portrait too faded or dull to be by Stuart. It is now enhanced by restoration, but Winstanley's coloring fits this early description in being unusually, or usually for him, muted in his other work. Winstanley did not have Stuart's rare ability, as seen in the Lansdowne head, to create flesh that could be both subtly colored with relatively pure tints and seemingly alive. Stuart's broken brushstroke or visible brushwork, creating a broken surface, added to his effect of actual animation or the movement of breathing. For Stuart, the blush of a cheek comes from beneath the skin and is not laid on top, as it is with Winstanley, who produced more opaque flesh. Next. To retrace, with regard to Winstanley, he began as a painter of American landscapes, an example of which is this river view. He also created a large nativity altarpiece, panoramas of London and Charleston, and one bust-length and some bust-length portraits during the 1790s. When his friend Baker, who had exhibited his altarpiece and panoramas, acquired Stuart's full-length portrait of Washington in early 1798, however, Winstanley took a new direction. Next. In his first response, he painted for sale through Baker's Museum a full-length likeness of John Adams on a smaller scale, which was not from life, as the advertising falsely claimed, or at least not from sittings. It is based probably on an amalgamation of available likenesses of the second president. Next. One possible source is Cornelius Thibault's engraving after an unknown artist in about 1797, which could be copied and then flipped for a reverse image. Next. Although Winstanley's head of Adams, now on the right, his full length is on the Adams, is an easily identifiable likeness, the anatomical disproportion and incorrect perspective are telling aspects of a picture that assumes importance as a documented work by Winstanley. In composition, with its curtain, columns, and pose, the Adams painting is partly derived from its Lansdowne type precedent. Concerning the current discussion, what is important is that there are echoes of the Adams portrayal in existing copies or derivatives of the Lansdowne portrait, and these reverberations are indicative of Winstanley's hand. An example is a Detroit picture on the left with its swirling curtain. Next, the 3/4 length portrait of Washington at the Detroit Athletic Club, that here is on the right, borrows and departs from Stuart in composition and pose, but the head is essentially the Sukli head. Supporting a Winstanley attribution, the swirling curtain at the right stems from the Adams portrait. It zigzags around the column from left, right to left in the same manner. Next, there is even a suggestion of fringe at lower right that follows the Adams prototype. That's there at the right there, the Detroit image. And then the Adams is on the left. Next. Relatedly, the fringe curtain at upper left, just behind the tassels in the likeness at Washington and Lee University, is not found in Stuart's Lansdowne copies or Winstanley's other copies, but rather in the Adams portrait. There's a detail of it there on the left. Next, even the White House picture incorporates an idiosyncrasy found only in the Adams picture and not in Stuart's work. The Adams rug appears to have flower petals strewn across it rather than integrated into the rug design. Next. To a less extent, but still quite visibly, the blossoms in the rug design in front of Washington's right foot in the White House picture have the same effect of odd projection, particularly just in the foreground. This is not found in Stuart's work or Winstanley's other copies, and so was evidently not in the original Baker prototype. Next. In the Baker portrait's absence, it cannot be known how it varied from Stuart's original, but his two other known replicas, except with respect to the feet, which are apparently different. The feet, let me say again. In the Baker portrait's absence, it cannot be known how it varied from Stuart's original and his two other known replicas, except with respect to the feet, which were apparently different. The feet in the White House version and 6 related facsimiles are presented in such a way that they seem to be slightly floating, with the toes pointed downward. This is not instinctively Winstanley, as in the Adams portrait, but the characteristic is one element that unites this group of paintings as after a missing work, the Baker replica by Stuart, rather than after the Lansdowne original. You can compare these, the Lansdowne on the right and the White House on the left. The Lansdowne original, the one on the right, was taken to England in 1796. There are 4 examples of this phenomenon. Next, please. Okay, that was making that point. Next. Okay, so these are these copies on the left, sorry. The next one. All right, these are those copies. Can you lift the image so that the identification is below it? Perhaps. I'm sorry, I can't speak to the person who's controlling
So
this.
on the left is the private collection, New York City, and on the right is the Redwood Library.
Okay. Next, please. Okay, this one and the one on the left is from the House of Representatives.
Correct.
And the one on the right is the Catholic University.
Correct.
Next. Okay. Although Winstanley closely copied Stuart's Baker portrait, he had met Washington himself. And perhaps because of this, or because of natural errors in copying, he made occasional adjustments to Stuart's template. An X-ray of the Detroit version shows that his near eye was once larger and thus distinct from the eyes in other versions by both Stuart and Winstanley, but closer to the near eye in the White House portrait at lower left. Winstanley also varied Washington's jawline, sometimes probably influenced by the fact that he knew Washington's false teeth made his mouth bulge slightly. This part of Stuart's original portrait had been criticized, so that criticism might have been an incentive to do it differently. Next. As is clear from the Adams portrait, Winstanley also liked shapely legs or pronounced calves. This is the this is the White House, the House of Representatives image with later hands that are after 1845. Winstanley, this is a good example of this, liked shapely legs or pronounced calves, whether the sitter had them or not, as in the case of Adams, who was notably short with stumpy or less sinuous legs. Winstanley's copies, made more than Stuart's originals, reveal an aesthetic appreciation of the silhouetted curve of Washington's calf, which possibly developed as he produced copies over time. Next. Winstanley's means of copying seems to have involved a grid system, partly because of minor variations in his versions. A similar grid system was used by the English artist Henry Bone when copying the original Lansdowne portrait after the Marquis of Lansdowne took possession of it in England. One way of transferring the image would be to create a grid across the surface of Stuart's original, using pins at the stretcher edges and connecting thread. Then copy the image within the squares onto a piece of paper with a proportionally related network of squares. The paper would then become a squared template that, with proportional adjustments to a corresponding grid, he could use for multiple, enlarged, reduced, or same-size copies. The fact that he changed scale and tried to sell smaller, full-length versions mentioned in newspapers is strong support for the grid theory. Winstanley's apparent business partnership with the New York-based merchant Suckley in July of 1799 was followed a few months later by a brazen proposal by Winstanley to Stuart himself that they enter into a partnership. Known for his procrastination, Stuart could not possibly keep up with the public demand for replicas of his portraits of Washington, and more than one opportunist took advantage of his lack of enthusiasm by supplying further copies. But with unusual boldness, Winstanley, whom Hamilton called, quote, lively, unquote, brought 3 full-length and several bust-length copies from the Baker portrait in New York to sell in Philadelphia, near where Stuart resided. At first, he advertised and exhibited them at the State House. Then, not being sufficiently successful in sales, he had them auctioned off in mid-December of 1799. In the interim, according to the historian Dunlap and an earlier 1806 newspaper account, Winstanley visited Stuart in his painting room and suggested that for a share of the profit, Stuart just touch the Baker portrait copies so that Winstanley could claim the master gave them the final touch, or they came from the master's hand. Thus, Stuart would participate in producing forgeries. This absolutely infuriated Stuart, who described Winstanley as, quote, little and obnoxiously forward. If Winstanley did not leave immediately, he threatened to throw him from his painting room window. As this was on the second floor and Stuart had an athletic build, Winstanley left quickly. On the day of Winstanley's auction in late 1799, George Washington unexpectedly died of complications from a virulent throat infection. When this became known in Philadelphia, 4 days later, the nation went into mourning. Almost immediately, Winstanley wrote to Washington's personal secretary and to Washington's friend, William Thornton. He claimed he managed to purchase from Stuart, at considerable expense, Stuart's original bust portrait of Washington done from life. The version mentioned appears to have been one of Stuart's replicas of his own bust portrait of Washington, named the Vaughan portrait, after the first owner. It probably resembled this replica by Stuart. Next. As mentioned before, Baker creditor Thomas Lang had the Baker portrait, an original work by Stuart, which he mistakenly trusted Winstanley to pack for the White House. Having stolen the picture, Winstanley also grabbed the chance when it became possible to appear to have acquired Stuart's portrait honestly. It cannot be coincidence that within days of the impoverished Baker estate being advertised as settled, the creditors having been paid, Winstanley, with his usual chutzpah, acted as though he were a repaid creditor. This could easily be believed, as he was closely associated with Baker, having worked with him for years, and both Baker and his wife were now deceased. Thus, 4 days after the Baker estate announcement, Winstanley advertised for the first time that he intended to pay all his outstanding bills and return to England. To finance his trip home and take advantage of seeming to rightly own the Baker portrait, Winstanley put this painting and many of his possessions, as essentially an art and book collection, up for auction a few days later in May of 1800. The sale was advertised at short notice for 3 days only and in one newspaper, the Daily Advertiser. Fortunately, the printed description of Winstanley's extensive list of library pictures and prints for sale gives significant information on Winstanley that has until now been unknown, suggesting that he had the prerequisites for a well-informed gentleman artist. Of great interest is the following description, quote, "The paintings consist of the much admired original picture of Washington, as large as life by Stuart. A bust also by the same. The picture is the only original of this size, and is that which Mr. Stuart took at the President's house in Philadelphia," end quote. In other words, the second, that bust, is the first portrait Stuart did of Washington, which was not possible as it had a different ownership. The auction cannot have been considered a success. As the bust portrait by Stuart did not sell, the much larger Baker portrait undoubtedly also did not meet the reserve price, and so was among the many works returned to the artist. When the order came through to pack the picture for the White House, Winstanley made the switch as planned, and in an extraordinary move, not only packed his forgery, but followed it to Washington, D.C. as well. Apparently leaving the Baker portrait in New York, he took with him lesser works that did not find buyers. Aside from pursuing the possibility of selling pictures in Washington, he had a well-placed friend there, William Thornton, to whom he had written about buying Stuart's bust-length portrait, and who had asked to see his Stuart purchase. Like many Washingtonians, Thornton went to see the White House likeness of George Washington after it arrived on July 5th and expressed disappointment that Stuart, whom he knew, had not produced a better result. In short, he did not think it, quote, a good likeness, end quote. Winstanley, who became Thornton's house guest, perhaps understandably, did not join him in the visit to the White House. Next. In fact, Winstanley appears to have felt some guilt because while still in New York, he almost immediately started to write a play about someone morally worse than he was, a dissembling gold digger and moral hypocrite who plans the rape of a much younger and penniless woman. If she refused him, she'd be thrown on the street. Called The Hypocrite Unmasked, a comedy in 5 acts, this first play by Winstanley is largely a pastiche, containing plot lines reminiscent of work by such diverse authors as Shakespeare and the Gothic novelist Anne Radcliffe, whose latest book he was reading at the time. As he labored over his draft, he consulted Thornton and others for advice. Satirical and lighter than Radcliffe's work, the play nevertheless reveals deep disillusionment with the world, which Winstanley describes as a, quote, fantastic theater of vice and folly, end quote, in which one is, quote, forced to play a part. Furthermore, the rich are so powerful that, as he wrote, quote, the wit and eloquence of a poor man only invite contempt, end quote. Moneylenders are no more than, quote, cannibals, unquote, and suggesting his own modus operandi, quote, the coin that is most current among mankind is flattery, end quote. According to the play, although virtue cannot really be read in a face, a man's respectability as a gentleman can be detected, possibly, as in the case of Winstanley, chiefly by his confidence. After consulting others about the script, Winstanley approached Dunlap, the historian mentioned earlier, who was a New York theater manager, to have the play produced. As Dunlap recounted in his later history of the theater, Winstanley, who could easily be excitable, made preposterous claims about the money-earning potential of his play. According to Winstanley, it would, quote, draw 20 full houses in succession, end quote, and overflow Dunlap's treasury, having been approved by the, quote, first, unquote, or most admirable men in the country. In fact, it would be a major attraction through the entire season, and then Winstanley would, quote, sell it to all the theaters on the continent. After Dunlap read and refused it, the play was never performed. Instead, Winstanley published it with an inserted criticism of Dunlap. But even this bid for public approval backfired. Its one reviewer called it, quote, a disjointed performance, which wears the appearance of being thrown together by accident. Not only that, but the, quote, moral principles and maxims are rendered almost ridiculous, end quote. About 2 months after Winstanley left Washington, David Longworth, a respected New York City book publisher, exhibited what must be the Baker portrait as the major attraction in his admission-charging gallery. Unlike Baker's museum, which had included curiosities such as live snakes, Longworth's gallery sold books, prints, and art supplies. Not all pictures were for sale, but the Baker portrait surely would have been for a high enough offer. Longworth featured, as he described it, quote, Stuart's celebrated portrait of Washington, large as life, end quote, 8 by 5 feet, and of the Lansdowne type as it was described. The corresponding entry in the accompanying catalog asserted in a challenging way that Stuart, quote, in speaking of this picture, said it was his masterpiece, end quote. This descriptor, not common, links it to the Baker portrait, which repeatedly evoked this response. The entry also touted the picture as a, quote, unquote, strong likeness, so that those who knew Washington might imagine his actual presence. This was also said of the Baker portrait, quote, like the man himself instead of a painting, end quote. Longworth advertised the picture's availability to viewers from February to late May of 1801, and then after a pause advertised it a final time at the end of the year on December 3rd. This is before Winstanley evidently took the painting to England by or in the spring of 1802. The disappearance of the artist and the Longworth picture at the same time supports its identification as the Baker portrait. After obtaining funding in Boston, Winstanley managed to leave the United States with his reputation largely intact. He arrived in Liverpool with his full-length Baker copies rolled up, including, according to Dunlap, the Baker original by Stuart. Because Winstanley could not pay the import tax, he left one version rolled up in the custom house, where it was found as documented with other substitutions for taxes years later. Next. The found portrait, now at the Lady Lever Art Gallery, has historical importance as the last known member of the Baker series by Winstanley. This portrait was unlike the others in showing Washington wearing the medal of the Society of the Cincinnati, which was created for officers of the Revolutionary War. That this large discarded portrait was deemed an inferior painting, worth sacrificing, suggests that Winstanley had something more valuable. Unfortunately, there is very little documentation on Winstanley after his return to London. He rarely appeared in the public record. He continued not to sign pictures, and by changing careers, he became so little known that the location of any of his artwork in England is not preserved. Yet some facts can be pieced together. In late November of 1807, Winstanley's debts caught up with him, and he experienced the humiliation of being arrested in London and sent to a famous debtor's jail called Fleet Prison. Next. He owed money to a persistent lawyer and local upholsterers. Like others who were able to afford it, Winstanley had a room in the prison, shown here, for which he paid in advance. But after his payments stopped, he had to sacrifice a separate room for a common one. He often complained, and about a year later, he managed to make a daring escape. Disguised as apparently a washerwoman in an outfit described as, quote, dark-colored, spotted cotton gown, end quote. When he was recaptured, he had his pictures with him and repeatedly maintained with regard to the clothing switch that, quote, any person might do the same, end quote, an example of his tendency to deflect blame. After being transferred short-term to Newgate Prison for greater security, Winstanley was released in December of 1808 at a recorded age of 44. When Winstanley next appears in the public record, it is as a publican's broker or a middleman working irregularly on commission between brewers and pub keepers. At the time, these brokers were widely associated with manipulating and cheating and setting up financial arrangements. This has to be the same Winstanley, because with some changes, he essentially reenacted a scene from his play, where the accused villain made a startling counterclaim, becoming the accuser and reversing the truth of what had taken place. The ruse met with success in the play, but not in real life. Winstanley had been walking on Grub Street, an area known for low-end booksellers, at night in the spring of 1825, when he challenged a man walking near him as to who he was. On being questioned himself, Winstanley, who appeared intoxicated, claimed to be a constable, and taking a large volume out of his coat pocket, said it was his charge book. Then he bizarrely struck the man's head with the book, so that he cut his lip, and followed this with a claim that he would arrest him and his accompanying friend for assault. A watchman arrived, and the men involved immediately accused each other with contradictory stories. As if this were not strange enough, the next day, Winstanley, with an impulsiveness that appears to have been characteristic, changed his accusation, upping the offense to attempted robbery. This now involved an endeavor to steal his book. In the end, he lost the argument, and because he was impoverished, his fine was reduced to £10 for assault. He seems to have staged this farce expecting to be paid damages, whether by provoking his fellow wayfarers into an aggressive act or by lying about it. Other references to a William Winstanley are less grounded in evidence. For instance, he might be the man who died on November 22nd, 1838, at Rotherhithe workhouse across the Thames River from the center of London. This William Winstanley died of old age, estimated at 71, with an unknown occupation. Whether this is he or not, it is clear that he met a humbling end. Luckily for Winstanley, Stuart and Lang did not realize what had happened to the Baker portrait until after it had left the country. Sadly, given its cumbersome size, its historical fame, its precariously rolled state, and the poverty of its owner, it is highly unlikely that the Baker portrait still exists, or because of its quality, could exist somewhere unrecognized. 12 years after Winstanley left, British soldiers attacked Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. As they advanced through the city, burning government buildings, they made their way with torches toward the president's house as an inevitable target. In President James Madison's absence, and with the time running out, his wife Dolly ordered the removal of Winstanley's portrait. Next. The fact of its rescue has always given it special significance. She undoubtedly thought it was by Stuart, but it did not matter who painted it, because as Dolly Madison knew, the subject ensured that both the British and the Americans would see it as a national symbol. She had to prevent its desecration. Yet in an ironic twist, this portrait, threatened by the British, is the work of an Englishman. Part of the reason it has been so difficult to discard the White House portrait's false Stuart attribution is that the picture is now the focus of such a famous story. Dolly Madison eulogized in children's books as fearlessly postponing her own departure and herself grabbing a knife to cut the picture from its frame, could not have rescued a fake. Yet the painting is not believable as the missing Baker portrait, described as a genuine masterpiece. Instead, it is connected stylistically with portraits that can be linked not just empirically, but through documentation to Winstanley, a man who during his lifetime acquired the title, quote, genius swindler. Thank you. I think we can do questions, go to the questions and answers. And we might also go back here and look at some of them again if we need to. I think I'll just, this, hi.
Hi, everyone. If anyone has any questions, you can type them down below, say something nice, and I can repeat them as best I can. Any questions at all? I'm curious about how many copyists were working around Stuart. We know his daughter was painting them. I'm just curious. It seems like there's a whole industry around Stuart.
Yeah. We don't know the identity of a lot of these copyists. There are hundreds of copies of his George Washington. The Athenæum head, the one that's on the dollar bill.
You know, I've got to say that the Redwood version of Winstanley is actually one of the better copies. It seems to me. I mean, I'd have to
Yeah.
look at the others, but it's it doesn't look like such a hack work as some of the others.
Yes, that's right. I think it's um, definitely, yeah. And I know Jane Stuart is often, when the attribution is not known and you know it isn't by Gilbert Stuart, one of the names that comes to mind is, well, I'll just say it's by Jane. And so she sort of gets, there are all these sorts of mixed up attributions that are put in her, under her name in a kind of a box there. This is Jane Stuart. It's, it's so much, it's so mixed up if anyone starts to work on her. Um,
Are there any are there any known copies of the Lansdowne portrait that are known to be absolutely by Jane Stuart?
yes, there are documented instances where she did copy it, and we know that she did it because of that.
Okay, so here's a question. How did the Rhode Island State House get its Stuart portrait of George Washington? Do you have any idea?
Yes, I've now forgotten. Um, the yeah, there was a delegation from the Rhode Island government that ordered that portrait. Um, and there was another one as well. There were two of these State House portraits that were specially ordered from Stuart.
You may know that we have some copies by Charles Burt King of Washington portraits as well, so he can be added to the mix.
Yes,
Anyone else with a question?
I sort of have a question. I wonder if it was clear the comparison of Stuart's own work next to Winstanley that people can see it, the difference. Sometimes it's not absolutely. Some people are more visual than other people, and some people would notice it immediately, and other people, I find that it's difficult for them to see it.
It was very visible in your presentation. I mean, the translucence of the cheeks and the coloring below,
Yeah, I
and
hope so.
also, I mean, absolutely. Um, let's see. Somebody else just wrote it and said, yes, the difference was clear. I mean, you can really do you can really tell once you're drawn to making that comparison, it's definitely visible for sure. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And now I can, when people ask me about it when I'm downstairs, I can explain and tell them because a lot of people come and look at that portrait and immediately assume it's Gilbert Stuart. And for a long time, it was thought to be by Jane Stuart, but now we know otherwise. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, friends, thank you. And I'm so sorry about my voice. I don't know what to do. But thank you all so much. And thank you, Professor Dorinda Evans, for a fascinating talk. And we'll talk very soon uh, between us. Thank you so much, everyone. Have
Thank
a
you.
great evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye.